Our first speaker is Dick Frederickson. Dick is a member of the Tucson Space Society, a longtime space enthusiast, old L5 member, and his talk is entitled Social Security as a Source of Space Funding.
A title like that, Social Security as a Source of Space Funding.
Okay, did you hear that? As with a title like that, Social Security as a Source of Space Funding, we're liable to suspect that I'm the most arsonist space enthusiast in town. Either that, or perhaps a Social Security enthusiast who just figured out a space angle for an excuse to talk here. Actually, I am a space enthusiast, and beyond that, I hope for a grand and glorious human future, of which the move to space is only a part. But it's a large part, and it will require large gobs of long-term investment. That's where Social Security comes in, and there's no larceny about it. Social Security should have been founded upon investment to start with. In the last 10 years, it has become conventional wisdom that Social Security faces a great crisis and could go bankrupt. The crisis is said to lie in the fact that a large bevy of baby boomers will start to retire and will have to be supported by a smaller generation which they begat. More than that, people are living longer too, so that this larger generation will produce a large, disproportionate, unexpected number of survivors to collect Social Security. And having gone on the rolls, they'll go on collecting longer than originally planned. The upshot is that the smaller generation will have seniors on their backs for decades. That, at least, is the perceived crisis. In my view, it's an artifact of perceptions. But the perceptions are built right into the Social Security system. Social Security was originally conceived as an obligation to be passed from generation to generation. Workers in the workforce would pay payroll taxes to support a smallish contingent of retirees. When their turn came, they would be supported in turn by later generations. At the time, in the late 1930s and 1940s, you could expect that with the retirement age set at 65, there would in general be about 5 people in the workforce to support each retiree. No one gave much attention to what would happen if fluctuations in the birth rate caused a smaller generation to confront a larger generation which had gone before, or if geezers started living on and on. Besides that, there was a psychological point built right into the design. Am I standing in the light? Built right into the design of the system, which is that it was supported by a payroll tax. This encouraged the perception that retirees ride on the shoulders of the working generation. In fact, it institutionalized that perception. These effects could have been avoided if Social Security had been based in the first place upon investment. Payroll taxes, instead of being passed directly to current retirees, should have been spent upon current projects which would grow the economy. When retirees reached 65, they would be supported by a part of the national output which was traceable directly to their investment. If a subsequent workforce was smaller than one that went before, it really wouldn't matter because their taxes would be going into investment for their future, not used to pay the earlier retirees. And if by great good luck, retirees should start living longer, it would only be necessary to stretch out investments, not an ordeal imposed upon younger workers. In 1983, a small step was taken toward an investment-based system. Recognizing that the baby boomers were going to pose a problem, Congress raised Social Security taxes to more than cover retirement benefits and channeled a Social Security trust fund. Actually, there were two trust funds, for disability and for retirement, but the problems are the same for this discussion. Believing government securities to be the safest of all investments, the trust fund put the money into government bonds. 7 years later, in 1990, Senator Moynihan of New York attacked the system on the grounds that the money being fed back from the trust fund into the Treasury was in no way sequestered from any other Treasury intake. He had supported the trust fund on the understanding that it would be used to grow the economy, which would make it easier for subsequent workers to support future retirees. Instead, he said, the Republican administration had simply embezzled the trust fund money to use for general government expenditures. It struck me at the time that whether this constituted embezzlement or not would depend upon which government expenditures the trust fund money supported, because some government expenditures did indeed grow the economy. A true corrective would have been to ensure that whatever proportion of the Treasury intake came from the trust fund, at least that much of government expenditures must have this investment-like character to grow the economy and pay the Social Security benefits as they became due. That was the genesis of the proposal I'm leading up to. I'll leave that up a minute. In the 10 years after Moynihan's flurry, a lot of people came to support privatization as a cure for the Social Security problem, including most Democrats or most Republicans and some Democrats. In its most market-oriented version, workers would retain control, in part, over what was taxed for them from Social Security. They could invest it in whatever stocks and bonds they judged best. Another version, more popular with those human of the masses, would have the government do the investing as caretaker for the insurees. That latter version is probably dead on arrival because partisans of the private sector don't want the government having that much control over the private sector, while partisans of the government sector are not enthusiastic about turning taxes back to the private sector to start with. As for those who prefer governmental-type solutions, including most Democrats, some have simply denied the arithmetic or belittled the hardship of extra taxes. However, the current mainstream has conceded the desirability of investing the Social Security surplus, not the entire intake of social taxes. And they have found an investment which they like better than private stocks and bonds, namely paying down the national debt. To consider that proposal, we need a diagram which is more quantitative than the ones I've shown before. In this diagram, all the upward arrows and the national debt and the trust fund have widths scaled to the actual figures from 1999 fiscal year. If you want a feel for the absolute magnitudes, Each of the lower three layers shown there for the national debt is $1 trillion. Now there's a couple of interesting features of this diagram. One of them is that for the first time in many years, there's some green in it. The government did indeed retire some of the debt held by the public. And if you compare that with the money piped into the trust fund, you'll see that while they fell short of what was additionally borrowed by the trust fund, or from the trust fund, they didn't fall short radically. And in fact, the administration's proposed reform for Social Security is pretty much what they already did in 1999. The only difference would be, under their reform, that money lent to the Treasury by the trust fund would be sequestered for that purpose, and they promised to keep on doing it. Now, it's no doubt a good idea to pay down the national debt, but if it's paid down from the Social Security Trust Fund, you're only substituting quasi-obligations for firm ones. Every dollar of the trust fund money, or every dollar of Social Security taxes which goes into the trust fund is spent on, guess what? Government bonds. Using money borrowed from the Social Security Trust Fund to pay off other creditors is probably better than what the government was doing before, which was borrowing from the trust fund and from the public as well. However, it doesn't retire the national debt because the trust fund part keeps growing. But none of these proposed fixes touches upon the point which I want to address. Namely, private enterprise has no monopoly upon investment-like activities. I wonder, does anyone detect how this discussion is going to converge upon space development? It is, well, no, I'll hold that. It's perfectly legitimate that money which is taxed in support of long-range future obligations should be spent on appropriate government types of expenditure, whether public or private. Go back to basics. What is an investment? It's an expenditure, or at least it first takes on has any real impact upon the economy, seen in overview, when it is spent upon appropriate goods and services. Which are those? Well, it's those which are valued not for any immediate gratification which they provide, but for what they will do to expand the output of value in the future. By that standard, a number of government activities have an investment-like character. So, let me propose a real Social Security reform. These are just words concealing all sorts of difficulties, but they're important words, drawing attention to what we might like to do in principle. Envision a new system. The entirety of Social Security taxes is invested in invested in what? Private or public sector? Well, that's an ample discussion for another day. My personal preferences would include some privatization, but the handling of the government part is where some innovation is required. So let's focus on that. To get going, assume a future history. For some years, the entirety of Social Security taxes has been directed into investment-like government expenditures earmarked as Social Security investments. In subsequent years, the performance of those investments has been monitored and a dollar value has been placed upon their contribution to the economy. That much of the government's general revenue, as opposed to Social Security taxes, is now belongs to the Social Security system and is used to pay benefits or is reinvested. Voila, we have an investment-based system. But I ran it by rather quickly. Study the picture a little again and consider some implications. The entirety of Social Security taxes being directed into investment-like government expenditures. A part of the government's general revenue being identified as a return upon past investments and either used to pay off benefits or roll over into new investments. To pay off benefits or roll over into new investments. Obviously, identifying eligible government expenditures requires a great deal of thought. And massive accounting innovations would be required to calculate its return and earmark the resulting government revenue. But assume we can do that. Switching to an investment-based system poses a transition problem. How do we get from here to there? In our future history, we assumed that we had some investment attributable revenue coming into the government, and that paid off benefits. But when first we start to direct Social Security taxes into investment-like government expenditures, what do we do about the benefits already due to existing retirees? Now, privatization schemes often have difficulty with this. We're told that you'll have to perhaps pay benefits and pay a little extra to get your capital going. And there is talk of unavoidable pain and general sharing of sacrifice. Well, my scheme has a more graceful alternative because investment-like government expenditures have been going on for a long time. We just didn't count them as such. So, supposing we do retrospectively the accounting job that was assumed in our future history, we look over past the government expenditures, figure out an investment-like character, and calculate some return upon them, and direct it into Social Security benefits. That much of Social Security taxes is now freed up to support ongoing government investments and perhaps new ones. Well, you can see that it's going to require some negotiation. But we're back, I think, to the topic of the conference, which is space development, because there are a number of government activities which can be regarded as investments because their reward lies wholly or partly in the future. For example, education, research, public health, defense, and amongst others, the opening of new geographical domains. That's where we come in. We're plugging an investment whose return is literally the universe, or at least a spectacular increase in our geographical domain and in that of all of humanity. Making Social Security an investment-based system and doing the investment in government expenditures selected for their investment-like character would have a very beneficial effect on our discussion of the national budget. Expenditures whose reward lies in the future would receive greater weight. In the past, we've overvalued some expenditures and undervalued others. I would love to see the day when advocacy groups for the poor and for the elderly and for minority, whomever, become protective of investment in space development because they count it as part of their prospects for the future. Casting it as a source of future Social Security benefits works toward that effect. Well, I'll close with this. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to further the opening of the space frontier. What rocket scientists get to do with their rocket science depends critically upon public perceptions of long-term versus near-term values, especially those in the public sector. Values generated in the public sector are difficult to compare head-to-head, and present value for present value with those generated in the private sector. But we have to make the comparison if we're going to make sensible decisions, both public and private. I would say that in considerable part, this is a job for economists, financial experts, and accountants. If you're one of these, or if you're in training to be one of these, you may yet become a hero of the space frontier. The substance of this talk, along with a fuller discussion of government investment as related to Social Security, can be found online at www.wordedge.org. Thank you for your attention. I expect this proposal will work its way into the public discussion in 20 or 30 years. That's the way things usually work.
Yes, Paul.
I get the impression that Albert's the government more or less investments, psychoelectric investments, so having a hindsight feeling of about minus 50%, that is they never return more than half what you spend on it. What are you going to do if all of the government projects consistently yield negative returns?
Well, for one thing, public projects tend to have negative returns because we keep changing our values. I mean, those dams were well enough liked in their day. Nowadays, we're worried about their impact on the ecology and any other things. I don't know that private enterprise can do much better at anticipating things far off. It has been suggested by advocates of privatization that you get a much larger return from your private investment, and they cite figures as high as 20% if you own certain stocks and bonds and hang on to them for 40 years. But my own impression of the stock market is that the biggest returns are to financial manipulation. I doubt that real impact upon the economy that large. And I doubt that a huge infusion of capital coming from Social Security payroll taxes could maintain that rate of return, even without skullduggery. One has to assume that the return on investment, like most other things, is subject to some diminishing returns, that the reason there are diminishing returns to investment as you look for more and more projects to invest is that you have to start looking for the ones which take longer to mature for the same amount of input. And indeed, it would have to be that way, or you'd be unable to account how it is that if you could get the same return no matter how much you added, why isn't it being added now? Something must be ratioed. And I would say it's essentially the selection of investments with a certain return, and that this varies with the length of time you're going to take. You can't undertake all the projects at the same time. Ingrid?
Are we to assume that what you're saying that because we have payroll taxes for Social Security anyway, you might as well take advantage of the system that is available to us?
Did everyone hear that? Ingrid wants to know, am I saying that because we have these payroll taxes and the Social Security system, we might as well take advantage of it? I assume the implicit alternative is that maybe we should do away with Social Security and not have such taxes and let people do their own investing. I don't think, you're right, I am counting upon political regularities. I think this system is going to last for a long time, and it's going to be difficult to get it really shifted to an investment basis, but that it ought to be. Who's next? Where's Tom?